and welcome to another Space Innovation Talk. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored to have with me today Mr. Geoff Carrigan, who is a program manager for the Unified Data Library. Geoff, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Wolf, for having me.
And I know there's a lot of people that have questions about what the Unified Data Library is, and it's been coming up quite a bit in recent conversations, especially with the recent release of the Space Force as a digital service document that General Kreider put out as a chief technology officer. So I'm really excited to talk about what the Unified Data Library is and what it can provide to folks who need the access to the right data at the right time. Before we get into the UDL though, I would like to hear a little bit about your background, Mr. Carrigan. How did you end up being the program manager for the Unified Data Library?
Yeah, great question, Bill. Thank you. Well, I spent 13 years active duty in the Air Force as an engineer. I did a lot of support for the National Reconnaissance Office. I worked up at the Air Force Academy, but my last active duty assignment was actually as the chief engineer for the National Space Defense Center, which is now the Joint Task Force for Space Defense out at Schriever, which was a whirlwind of experience for me. I feel like I learned and aged a lot in that short period of time. But it was a really cool opportunity to see how fun data is. And of course, everyone loves data. It's the most fun thing that gets talked about on the Hill. And of course, when I'm saying that, I'm being very sarcastic. But what I realized out there is if we are really going to leverage technology and become a digital service, we had to stop thinking from the pointy end of the spear backwards, right? We really needed to look at how do we handle the less fun part of that process. And so when I got out of active duty, I looked for companies that were really leading in that fight and fell in love with what the Data Program Management Office was doing with the Unified Data Library and was fortunate enough to come onto the team when they were looking to kind of grow the program and have someone jump on the front of that train to help move it forward.
Great, thank you. I know that when I had an opportunity to work with, it was Brigadier General Saltzman at the time, now it's Lieutenant General Saltzman, he used to say from a multi-domain ops perspective that it's all about the data. In other words, it's great that you have maybe a graphic user interface that's impressive, but if you don't have the data behind it for the analytics that are needed to make the decisions, then it's just that. It's just a pretty picture. So I'm really excited to talk about the Unified Data Library. Can you talk a little bit about the background and how it came to fruition?
Yeah, do you mind? I've got a slide here I'd love to pull up to kind of help share that story. What I saw out at the National Space Defense Center was not unique to the NSDC. Really, what we were dealing with was lots of different information from tons of different providers. You've got documents, intelligence data providers. You've got actual edge node sources, things like radar feeds, Link 16, whatever that might be. And then you've got lots of consumers of that data, and it might be an entire community, it might be a single developer or an analyst. Regardless of who those consumers and providers were, it was really challenging to connect them through a common means. And so what I was seeing out at the NSDC is that we were trying to look at these new technologies and evaluate them for how successful they were. And the thing that kept throwing us for a loop is we didn't have a common data set. So each person's tool seemed to look really good with their own pre-scripted data, but how would it work in the real world? And we knew that even the real world had data limitations where we were burning disks and running them across the floor and trying to find a security guy who could quickly validate something before you drop a 1995 CD-ROM in a Windows 2000 computer. So what we realized was if you could just solve that one problem of access to the data, that would go a long way. And so before I joined the Unified Data Library team, they went after a small business innovative research contract and looked to handle that problem with a very small lens. They looked to handle the commercial space domain awareness data problem. And what they realized is that the commercial partners were motivated to do this, right? They wanted an ability to get their information out in front of you. They wanted an ability to share that information before contract awards so that you could see how good it was. And they wanted an ability to feed tools and demonstrate why their data was better than everyone else's. And so like most things in our pivot from historical acquisition models to this new digital service, industry really helped to kind of lead the charge on that. And we saw a really great response that's now been followed up with the government providers and some really great top cover from previous Chief Technology Information Officers of the Air Force and General Kreider and others, really supporting the sharing of data and seeing that as the common backbone. And so what we looked at as the problem set was not fixing everything for everyone, right? We did not want to be the next program that tries to do too much and can't get off the ground, but we just wanted to look at data. And it's been really fun to see how the Unified Data Library has been able to do that, recently being signed into being the operational data layer for the Space Force by General Raymond, and as Data One for the ABMS program, and even being used in CENTCOM right now by AFCENT as the kind of tactical edge, connecting those legacy assets back to a common cloud-supported infrastructure for data. So that's really kind of where the motivation came from.
So I have to ask, as you pause here for just a moment, you know, the concept and topic of standardization of data formats always comes up. What is your approach, or what is the program's approach to standardized data formats, which I think people would argue that's going to take a long time if you try to standardize the formats. And so how do you get around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we looked at how to handle the data problem, we kind of looked at these 8 key tenets in the middle. And I think that your question really drove a lot of them is how do you trust the data, right? How do I make sure that I know what the data is? I can feed it into my tool. Do I standardize things? Do I not standardize things? And so if you'll let me, I'd love to kind of walk through some of this to kind of answer that question.
Yes, sir.
What you see on the left here was that traditional operations floor where you had a data source and an application. Maybe your data source fed 2 applications. Maybe your application fed from 2 data sources. But at the end of the day, that accreditation was your boundary layer that prevented you from changing things because it took 12 to 18 months to get an accreditation. And so what we wanted to focus on was how do we change the game and move from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, where you're still having to accredit an application and a data source. But once it's accredited into the UDL or out from the UDL, it's now fair game to anyone else who's connected. So you get the added benefits of every time a data source is used, anyone who's connected to the UDL can use it. And so to kind of quickly go through what our tenets were that drove it was we had to make sure the data was secured, especially when you talk about a data layer that's replicated across unclassified, secret, and top secret levels. You needed to make sure that the data was secured. We also wanted the owners to be able to control access to their data, meaning that owner gets to say whether you get access or not the UDL team, not the data program management office, but the actual data owner is a third vote in that system alongside the system administrator and the security administrator to say who gets access. And then you want that data to exist in a way that allows it to be optimally exploited. And this kind of goes to your point of what format do you use? What we realize is there are many different definitions of what the common data set should be out there, but they all differ based on what the definition of good is. So the analogy that I like to use is if I want to go out to eat, Yelp is a great source for me. But if I want to invest in a franchise, I probably don't want to take my feedback from Yelp, right? I want to go to the library. I want to do some research. And so what we found is there's a format called JSON, and without getting too in the weeds here, because I can only fake it for so long, JSON allows you to add different definitions within your data set for any kind of information you want to add. And it makes it really easy for the party providing data to format their data into the UDL, and easy for someone to pull data out of the UDL and format it to their end tool. That really allowed us to be the Rosetta Stone between these different users where anyone could use any kind of format and it would get translated through the UDL. And what we really liked about that is how it supported our 4th tenet, which is making sure that the technology of the end user isn't limited. Because guaranteed, as soon as we define a standard of what the data is going to look like, we have just stopped progress. I'm sure you can recognize as an air guy, right, that if you say this is what information we're going to put into the heads-up display, and then new information comes in, now what do I do? Do I change the whole aircraft? Do I build a new airplane, right? But if I can format things on the front end to allow that flexibility, we felt like it takes the UDL out of the equation, where now I'm allowed to let technology run its course and not be limited by us. And then I'll just kind of quickly go through the other highlights, but making sure that information is easily understood. And the way we do that is through our open API documentation, what that means is as we create new ways to pull data, the definition of what that data looks like and how to pull it out is updated in real time. So we're no longer having to go back through historical interface control documents that I've spent most of my Air Force career reviewing and realizing they're outdated, or someone over saved their copy onto the gold copy and now everything's messed up. And that incentivizes data owners to participate. They want to be in there. They're able to connect to those end users without having to hold their hands through the connection process. And that really allows everyone to kind of benefit from the data. And 7 and 8 just are kind of usability things where we want the interfaces to look the same at each classification level and be able to support streaming data, historical data, bulk delivery, all those common distributions that you'd see.
There's so much application here, obviously. You know, we had a opportunity to speak with Dr. Emily Bonner at AFRL not too long ago about the Sprint Advanced Concept Training event. And really what we got into was the opportunity to create applications specific to operators to get the data that they need at the exact right time via spreadsheets, and doing some calls to the unified data library to get the information they needed to make the decisions. I mean, could we walk through a quick example about how that would work, or what that would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've created some pre-scripted searches here. Before I come back to that, let me just kind of show you the structure of the UDL. What I want to say up front here is that this is not meant to be the end interface. What this helps do is close the gap between application developers and data providers. When I was out at the NSDC, we had contracts that were awarded 3 years in advance that had to define what data we were going to purchase at what time, which wasn't very responsive to the actual operational needs. And then we were trying to build applications based on data we didn't have yet. So this is going to look a little bit like living in the matrix, but as you go through here, you can pull up one of these different services. So I'll do some basic click-throughs here that will hopefully be familiar to our space users. So if I look at current LSETs, I can filter based on any kind of parameters I want to see. So maybe I'll look at an inclination and some certain time frame. So now that I have this inclination, I can modify that to be less than or equal to 5 degrees. And then I can figure out if I'm going to break my computer with this call by returning a count, or I can just go live. And so we're going to take a risk here, Bill, because I like living on the edge. We're going to click that link and see what kind of information comes back. And as this is loading, what you're going to see is, great, I've got information in the UDL. So if I want to write an application that pulls information back, I can pull information here, because as you can see, I've got thousands and thousands and thousands of calls back. So if I'm building an application and nothing shows up from this search, maybe not the kind of data that I want to feed in. This is kind of that JSON format that I mentioned before, where the different markings of this data are each a different row in the data library. But this looks a little bit like living in the matrix. I don't expect operators to look at a screen like this and scroll through here looking for something to happen. But what this does allow an operator to do is understand that the data is out there. And now I can work side by side with someone like Dr. Bonner and her team to create those applications that pull the information in. And so I've built some pre-scripted searches that are kind of fun. So back a few months ago, we had Worldview 4, which performed an out of pattern of life maneuver. And basically what this is, hey, something is different with this system. And so through the UDL, during one of those Sprint Advanced Concept Training events, they had this realization of, hey, we're looking for things that are changing because we want to be the first to capture it. And they saw this anomaly detected. But then someone quickly realized, hey, wait a minute, the data mode on this is real. It's not test, it's not training. Holy crap, right? Something happened. We need to know about this. And what was really cool is quickly the team spun that up. They looked for a different notification to see whether it was just the decaying of a satellite, meaning, hey, it's time for this thing to be done. They looked through, there are only a few different objects that were scheduled to decay in that window, and this wasn't one of them. And so then they went back and they started scouring open news sources. And they came up with this article about a Chinese launch that put 2 remote sensing satellites into orbit, and through there realized that not everything was necessarily tracked as they acknowledged up front. They did another query in the UDL to see whether there's any maneuvers in that same window of the launch, and were able to find, hey, we found 3 abnormalities. We saw a maneuver sequence that wasn't reported and was detected in this window, and then that kind of got passed back to the real world people, and we never heard any more of what happened from there. But kind of a cool example where the training environment that Dr. Bonner was using to create these applications and figure out how they'd play was the same environment that catches some real world information and is able to throw that over the fence. And I've never been able to see that in my career, where you train like you fight on the data layer, right? We do it really well when it comes to those more fun technologies, but when it comes to data, I think we're all used to, hey, here's the disk that you're going to put in your system, and you're going to load this up, and we're going to play, and then we'll have some nice takeaways, and everything will be well scripted. This is a fun opportunity for us to show that using the same data layer, we can do both real test at the same time and pull that information out. So it was kind of a fun event for us.
There are so many applications, I think, for what you're describing here. Based on what you just talked about, it'd probably be pretty easy to put together a real world vignette in a training mode and actually walk through, real time what that would look like and what the impacts would potentially be, and provide that necessary training to the folks so they can really understand what their actions are going to be, but also what data they're going to have to go get to inform, again, their decisions, and then be able to describe to that multi-domain audience what the impact to space operations is going to be to the multi-domain audience. I mean, it seems like it's limitless in terms of applications.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun time to be in the space community right now, right? Because there is no playbook. We're writing the playbook. And how do you write the playbook without having that starting point of information? And so I think what you just said is exactly what we're going through right now, where you play a live event, you get some new information, you realize that if you had a certain tool that was automatically scraping that information, maybe you would have had a quicker response time. So you build that scraping tool. Now you have new information that might drive the design of a new application or tool. All the while, the operators who are trying to write these playbooks get to sit in that seat right alongside developers because of the technology that the digitalization of the Space Force is bringing to them. And so that's been really fun.
That is awesome. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing as a result of the information you're presenting as it applies to operations on a day-to-day basis? Can you talk a little bit about how this information is flowing into operations?
Yeah, so right now the Unified Data Library exists at the unclassified, secret, and top secret classification levels. It is scheduled to roll out at the SAP level as well. And so what we're seeing right now is the connection of tools at all the different classification levels that allow those operators to at least understand a common data frame. Now, like all things, it's not a solution overnight. So we're doing a lot of work right now and have felt really empowered by General Raymond and his direction to the Space Force to start integrating all of those operational data sets. But there's a long legacy of those direct connect systems that are going to be really hard to kind of transition from one operating architecture to another. And so we've seen that it really goes ahead to help us figure out how we get there, what's the priority, and it helps to kind of escalate. The more folks who come, the more want to come in. So I think we've seen a little bit of that tipping point happen within the Unified Data Library. And our hope is let the data speak for itself, right? If it's helpful, then we shouldn't have to be the PR folks standing behind it. I get excited about this stuff. I can't help it. But I hope that everyone else who sees the operational impact of having a common data layer at each classification level really will help them do that well.
Now, let's just say I'm a company that I'm producing data. I want to get data into the UDL, and I want to learn more about the UDL. What are my next steps? What do I do?
Great question. So we actually do a monthly community demo. And so my email was on the first slide. People can reach out to me direct. They can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share that invite out to any and everyone. And basically what we do is a longer version of what we just stepped through, where we bring on a partner from the industry each month who's already connected to the UDL to kind of walk through, hey, here's how our tools pull information from the UDL. Here's what we do with it. And through that process, we explain how you can submit your company or data source to be onboarded into the UDL. And we'd love to work more with them.
Outstanding. Well, great information, a lot of discussion about the UDL, a tremendous amount of application as a result of the information sharing that's going on right now. I think this is truly an innovation step for the Space Force in getting all the data together so that we could start to quantify and do the analysis. I think it's important to mention too that you aren't in the analytics game. When you start talking about data aggregation, that's where you stop, isn't that right? I mean, there's somebody else doing some analytics.
Yeah, so I think from a company perspective, right, certainly a little bit risky to say, hey, we're not going to bring this to the end, right? We're going to create the data sharing architecture. I think that's helped more than it's hurt because it really takes people's guard down, right? If you're a data provider and you know that you're not competing with the folks who are trying to aggregate all the data, it allows them to understand that they can freely put their information in and still own their back-end tools to show off what great things they're doing. But yeah, we stay out of the visualization business. It's on the third-party developers or the Dragon Armies and Dr. Bonner's teams to do that type of work based on what's needed by the operators.
Phenomenal information. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, Jeff, for talking about the Unified Data Library. Looking forward to having additional discussions in the future as your success continues to progress.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Talk soon.